The title of this talk, this final talk, is Healing a Wounded Church and Nation, a Roadmap to Restoration. And I look at them separately in distinct spheres, as I should as an American, but what I find is there's a lot of corollaries between some of the cultural unhealth in the church and also some of the cultural unhealth in American society. But first I want to clean up a little bit of a statement I made at Mass, at the end of Mass. I have a lot of respect for Governor Walz. I think he's done a really good job managing this crisis, and I happen to disagree with a part of his latest order which allowed for retail stores to open and not churches. The latter, churches, enjoy First Amendment protection, and I think would have done a very good job with the protocols. So I think that'll get fixed. My guess is in the coming week. And again, lots of respect for Governor Walz. I happen to disagree and happen to think that that was a misstep. In times of crisis, and especially in the United States, we have to go back to founding principles and values. When we don't do that, and I think of the Korematsu case and an incident in World War II where we interned Japanese out of fear, these are times where we go back to our founding principles and we make sure that those underlie our action. Now, what can a state or a nation expect of a church, an ecclesial institution, to not transgress the public good? This is why the clergy abuse crisis was so problematic in all of its scope, is because the church was taking actions that were deleterious to the public good. So we have to respect both sides of that. That the church has a duty to not transgress the public good, and states and nations have a duty to uphold those fundamental rights. And the freedom of religion is first among many. Okay, I began my talk last time referring to two seminal documents from Pope Benedict and Pope Francis. This time, I want to refer to a seminal document, the first document of John Paul II, St. John Paul II, and it comes from 1979, Redemptor Hominis, Christ the Redeemer of Humanity. And John Paul II says something just really instrumental there. He calls it the law of the gift. He says that human fulfillment and meaning are best understood when we are serving another, when we are serving our brothers and sisters, when we are serving the Lord, when we are laying down our life for another. This is what it means to be truly human, to be free, and this is where ultimate meaning and fulfillment are found. I think of marriage, Christian marriage. That's what it's all about, pouring out your life for another, the law of the gift. When we give ourselves, that's when good things happen. And that's a central thesis of my talk, is that in the exercise of authority and power, we have to understand power as humble service. Similar to the writing and teaching of Father Romano Guardini, a 20th century German philosopher, theologian, and priest, who said real power is understood as service, similar to service that Christ demonstrates on the cross. Now, each of our three modern popes have encountered the risen Christ in their own lives. It's very evident. And this provides then the foundation for a life of authentic and generous service. And we see that in their lives. I talked last week or 2 weeks ago about affective and substantive dimensions of the faith, our relationship with the Lord, and also the substance of what we believe. Today, I also want to highlight another dialectic, which is communion and mission, or communion and service, that we are called to enter into deep communion with the living God, and from that foundation also exercise a life of mission, bringing that love of God into the world, serving God and serving our neighbor in a generous way. Both are found in the love of God. The Second Vatican Council also followed this same pattern, which I'm following in the talks, which could be described as ad intra and ad extra. First, we look at the nature of the church, and then we look at the nature of the church vis-a-vis the world she is called to serve as an instrument of Christ. And what I've tried to do in these talks is look at the nature of the church, our encounter with Christ as disciples, and then what does that encounter mean for going out as missionary disciples? How do we engage the world in a way that's consistent with our faith? And the talks have followed more or less that same dynamic. Now, I also believe that deepening our communion with God, walking with God in the light of the risen Christ, and embracing authentic power as understood as service for the good of the other more than anything else is the corrective for church culture and is the corrective for American culture. Now, real quick, I'm not advocating a theocracy in the United States. I believe that state and religion, nation and faith remain in their separate spheres, however they interact. Thomas Jefferson's wall of separation is grossly misunderstood in terms of what he meant and how it's interpreted. However, talking about different spheres, but spheres that interact for the common good. When I was in South Texas, I began by focusing on my sabbatical on restorative justice in my research and writing. But I realized that you can't heal wounds that are afflicted upon people if you don't examine and confront the ecclesial culture that in some respects is causing harm. You have to get at the root. If you don't get at the root, then the harm will continue to be perpetuated. And this was made clear to me on a trip to West Virginia and a conference that was sponsored by National Leadership Roundtable. Great conference, brought about 250 people together. And that same need for cultural conversion in the church was brought home very clearly to me and others, both in the harm that it produced in West Virginia, as we tried to do that work of restorative justice and healing, but also the harm that will continue to occur unless our ecclesial culture is reformed and transformed. Then, as I got back into my research and writing, the pandemic hit. And we saw all sorts of injustices and harm and disparities that are laid bare, which I think offend God's justice. God, who is the God of graciousness and gratuitive love, seeks the goods of the earth for all people. But wounded hearts and unreformed and converted hearts seek to amass more and more and live in that apathetic place that I talked about Pope Francis mentioning last time. That place of desolation and anguish that is born of a covetous and yet complacent heart. So my thesis is, and this is where I'm going to direct my writing and research from here on out, because I think this is what I'm excited about. I haven't seen a lot of other things written in this area, and so this is my focus. That when you get to church culture and American culture, you see a lot of corollaries, cultural corollaries, similarities in terms of where the culture gets off the tracks. They're actually very similar dynamics. And then it produces also similar dynamics and harm. And so that's what I want to explore today in my final talk, and that's where I'll be headed in the balance of the research and writing. And again, not proposing a theocracy, but trying to understand where these connection points are. Now, this thesis relies on Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, who just is, I can't think of anybody more brilliant in the Western tradition. St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas are up there, but so much of their writing is owed to the great thought of Aristotle. Now, the Oxford biographer Barnes puts it this way in the opening chapters of his little introduction. It's actually called that to Aristotle. He says, Aristotle bestrode antiquity like a colossus. Everything that was taken up after him in ethics, in political philosophy, in law, in justice, refers back in some way to the thought of Aristotle. He's literally thought about everything that then in the succeeding 2.5 millennia is taken up. Extraordinary. And this is what he says, which I think is very relevant to this thesis. Order in the personal soul, a rightly ordered soul, leads to the health of one's soul, which he describes as eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the thing that all people seek as an end in itself, which is a life of human flourishing and happiness. Not happiness as contentment, but happiness as deep fulfillment. And it comes from a life that has a soul that is rightly ordered among the virtues, right? Temperance and justice, fortitude, and I'm missing one here, courage. And justice is the most important of the four virtues for two reasons. One is it moderates the other three virtues. It keeps them in right order. But it's also the only one of the virtues that moves beyond itself to the good of the individual, seeking the good of the other, what is their due. And so what also happens, and this is one of the reasons why Aristotle advises for philosopher kings. So if a philosopher king is going to presumably have a rightly ordered soul, will be a person of wisdom. Therefore, they will lead well and make wise decisions and use practical wisdom or prudence to put those decisions into practice for the good of the people they serve. Now, we don't have philosopher kings, and he might have been onto something. Now, the converse is also true. Disorder in the soul, a lack of virtuous living, a lack of even seeking eudaimonia, results in disorder, not only in one's life, but disorder in the polis, in the city. Disorder in the collective that person is called to serve as either an elected official, a bishop, a pastor, whoever it might be. Aristotle, I think, is right on the mark, and I think this applies relevantly, in my opinion, to our time, both in terms of church culture and ecclesial culture. In times of decadence, to borrow Ross Douthat's description of the United States culture, we exist in a long, slow decline. That's his thesis, and he says this happened in Rome. It's happened also in America, I would say in Western Christianity and Catholicism in the West, it's also true there. A long, slow decline. Now, he says a disjunctive event can come and actually get us hopefully back on the right track. It upsets this long decline and wakes us from our slumber or our apathy. And he actually, in a prophetic way, said the pandemic might be that for American culture. My hope, and the hope of the laity even more, because they're fed up, is that the clergy abuse crisis and attendant cover-up would be that for the Catholic Church. That disjunctive event that says we cannot keep trotting the same path. We have to look at our culture that contributes to this harm. And what can happen is until this disjunctive event happens, we continue to have the injustices hidden from view. But when this happens, it is a test case. Now enter the clergy abuse crisis, as I said, and the pandemic. So it's not unlike a stress test. So when I was overweight, and I hope to not go back to that place, a couple times I had to do one of those stress tests, and you're jogging on the treadmill. Well, the fact that my heartbeat rises and I'm clearly out of shape, well, it's revealing all sorts of things that are potentially wrong. We are going through two stress tests in church and nation. For church, it's the clergy abuse crisis. It reveals all sorts of systemic things that need to be looked at. A culture that is not inclusive, a culture that is too clerical, right, that continues to produce harm. And so that has to be looked at, and it comes about because of the crisis. Similarly, the pandemic is revealing all sorts of injustices in American society, that our government is not working right. It also harkens to mind the warning at the beginning of our republic that a Republican democracy for such a vast land it could be problematic. Well, we're starting to see some of those complexities. And what happens is there is a populist response. So it's not surprising that both Pope Francis and President Donald Trump were elected. Now, I think there's good populism and bad populism. Good populism is populism that attends to the authentic good of the populace, the collective, the people that you're serving. And I think Pope Francis has ushered in a good populism. And I'll leave it to our viewers at home to try to figure out whether President Donald Trump has entered into a good populism. Again, I think the standard is, are you promoting the authentic good of the population that you're trying to serve? When that doesn't happen, that's when people get upset. In America, they react to elites who hold power and do so in a way not cognizant of the American people. In the church, it's bishops who hold power and continue to make similar mistakes, not all of them, but some of them, without an understanding that the laity are fed up and also have a role to play. Okay, let's move now to a number of cultural corollaries between ecclesial culture and American culture. Number one, authority and power understood as service. I think that's absolutely essential for both church culture and our national culture. And again, it goes back to Romano Guardini's great description that authentic authority and power are manifested in humble service, that puts the good of the other before self-interest. Now, one of the things that we've seen in America and in other places is we have had too many bishops and some pastors where there is either a lack of humility or a lack of courage or a lack of a life-giving relationship with the living God. And I would describe these bishops as company men of the institution. Now, you should want your bishop to be loyal to the church, absolutely. But a company man or a man of the institution always puts the reputation or what they think is the higher good ahead of what is actually the higher good. So they're advocating an apparent good. And what happens is these men who may not have Christ at the center of their life, the institution's at the center of their life. And so what they do is they perpetuate the institution and protection of the institution over all else. And when harm is at their door and injustice, these type of bishops, again, fall back on preserving their own sense of safety and self-interest and the interest of the institution. And that has led to great harm. And it's led to people leaving the church. It's led to the perpetuation of harm for victim survivors. And that culture, which is a clerical culture, needs to be upended. It is not consistent with the good of the church. Now, what's the American? And I would say, again, the popes, Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, John Paul II, they had Christ at their core. Archbishop Hebda has Christ at his core. That's why he's inclusive and humble and bold at times. And so that's important. He's a free man. Our Pope is the epitome of a man living in freedom. What's the American corollary? Self-interested politicians who think about their own next election rather than legislate for the common good. They take extreme positions so they don't get primaried, and that's their main interest, rather than trying to find the common good for the people. Now, in both cases, I think whether it be a bishop who is not serving in that way that Christ intends, or a politician who's not serving the people as our Constitution and our values intend, they're coming from a place of a soul that's not rightly ordered. And so therefore that disorder in the soul manifests itself outwardly to the collective. And I think that's what we're seeing too much of, and that has to be transformed. Number two, ideology. Ideology afflicts both church and state. What do I mean by ideology? Those who are ideologues or enter into ideology have a preconformed or a preset ideological prism through which they view all reality. And any reality that actually butts up against their ideological prism, they just set aside as fake news or whatever they want to call it. And so this ideological construct is like, to borrow Pope Benedict's metaphor, like a windowless bunker. So they're not actually meeting reality and people as they are and as it is, but rather just setting it aside if it's inconvenient. We see it in the church in the extremes of traditionalist Catholics on the way right side and progressive Catholics. I think the false move for the progressive Catholics is really moral relativism often, just setting aside church doctrine that isn't liked. On the right, it's sometimes also a relativistic approach to Catholic social teaching, but also a Gnosticism that they just simply know better, including know better than the Pope. And so in both cases, the extremes don't dialogue. They talk past each other. They use this crisis, the clergy abuse crisis, to wound as a weapon, rather than trying to find common ground. We have too few ecclesial moderate voices in the church right now, and we need more of that. Now, what about, and certainly Archbishop Hebda is one of those, and Pope Francis. Now, what about on the national side? Same thing. Ideology, and we see this in the federal government. They use this crisis to score political points. Now, there has been some legislation that's significant that has been passed, and that's a good thing. But intractable problems, immigration, environment, other issues that just never get solved in a way that's consistent with common good, because people are living from ideological prisms and bunkers, and so you don't legislate to the common good. There's no room for exceptions. Now, what are some exceptions in this? I would say Governor John Bell Edwards from Louisiana, Governor Hogan from Maryland. I think the Governor Mandoni from Rhode Island, notwithstanding her embrace of legalized abortion. I would also include Governor Walz and also have the same caveat and the caveat with regard to religious freedom. But these are, by and large, governors. Governor DeWine in Ohio, they are not ideologues. They try to promote the common good. Their first instinct is not to think about their next election, but to serve the people. They're competent, they're humble, they're inclusive, they're bold when they need to be. That's what we need more of in the United States, I think, as well. So a new culture of leadership that raises up church leaders and politicians who are virtuous, wise, humble, and bold, and who have well-ordered souls that allow them to then serve the collective in a way that's life-giving. And so number 3, what's at the center? Okay, I'm coming up on my time, so I got to keep moving here. What's at the center? In these situations for the church, Christ always has to be at the center. Christ is our end, our foundation. In the United States, what's the sovereign? So in the church, the sovereign authority is Christ. In the American culture, the sovereign authority is the American people. That's where the power comes from. What happens is these folks who don't have rightly ordered souls, and we're all working on it. I don't claim to have a perfectly rightly ordered soul as well. But what happens is those without rightly ordered souls do not keep Christ in the center of the church, on the church side, and do not keep the American people in the center as sovereign power on the side of the American culture. And so that is something that we have to attend to as we look to cultural conversion. Now, who suffers the most in this dynamic? Those on the margins. They suffer in a lack of injustice. They suffer harm because they're forgotten about. It's the poor and the marginalized. It's the victim of clergy abuse. They're literally relegated to the margins, and harm is perpetuated. So I want to end by suggesting a roadmap to restoration. And these are principles that both apply to the church and to American culture. So not only are there cultural corollaries in terms of the lack of health in each culture, but there's also a roadmap that suggests similar things that are consistent with a well-ordered soul. Number 1, humble and competent and bold leadership. So we need to create a new culture in the American culture that sees politics as a good. The highest form of charity is how Pope Francis and and others have described it. Rather than just thumb our nose at it, to raise up those type of leaders who have rightly ordered souls and can serve well the common good. We need that in the church side as well. We should look to the military, actually. The military does a fantastic job in the United States. There are noteworthy exceptions, but at teaching leadership skills based on the goal that those leaders are to foster. They do it in a way that's systematic, in a way that's organized and relies on best practices. Both nation and church could take a cue from this. Secondly, to go back to our founding principles. For the church, it's always Scripture and tradition. Catholic social teaching has a lot of important good things to say about the exercise of authority and a life of flourishing. Going to the Scripture is always the important lifeblood, the norma normans of our faith. For the United States, it's always the Constitution, it's the Declaration of Independence, it's our founding narrative, our founding values. These always have to be attended to, especially in a time of crisis. Number 3, we have to heal the wounds that are either self-inflicted or perpetrated. So many people, and this was my thesis last week, so many people, or 2 weeks ago, are acting out of unhealed wounds in both church and state. And that ends up causing harm and inhibiting leadership. So that has to be attended to and healed, and the church has a role to play. Social solidarity and a culture of accompaniment. On the church side, it's a culture of an accompaniment. The corollary in the American side, which David Brooks talks about, the columnist, is social solidarity. Seeing the ties that bind us as Americans, as human beings, as members of one human family. That has to be part of this cultural restoration. Similarly, and connected to that, is a special concern for those on the margins, a preferential option for the poor and the marginalized. Rather than allow them to be disproportionately affected in times of crisis, both in terms of church and nation, to have a special solicitude or care for them in the time of need. And then holding things in dialectic tension, both on the American side and in the church, living in that balance, rather than going to the extremes, holding things in that dialectic tension, which holds values together and lives in this place of life. And finally, I would say faith and reason for reform, both in the church and also our nation. We have to employ both faith and reason. In the American side, the American context, faith was part of the Declaration of Independence. It was part of our original story, and there is room in our common good and also our public square for faith-based ethic as well. So my hope, friends, is that Christians and primarily Catholics would lead as a leaven in society this cultural restoration, that we would lead it, Catholics and laity for the church, really demanding what is your due, a church culture that works and that is an instrument to Christ. And then on the nation side, to work as a leaven for good. As I said 2 weeks ago, apathetic, lukewarm American culture is not going to be transformed by apathetic, lukewarm Christians. We have to encounter Christ in a deep way. We have to, as Peter says, sanctify Christ in our hearts. So from that foundation, like our 3 modern popes, we can live a life of authentic service, a life that is consistent with a well-ordered soul, and also be a life that is attractive to others. That's really what evangelization looks like in the American context. As always, I don't have all the answers. This is my kind of thinking after a number of months in South Texas, and I look forward to our faith formation year. We're going to have 2 to 3 book studies during the summer as well. Thanks to Josh Center and Sarah Moon for live streaming this and all the great work they're doing. Thanks to Julie Craven for her promotion of our faith formation and her great communications work. Great to be with you. I took an extra few minutes, so one of these days you're going to get your minutes back. remember that God loves you. Keep his commandments. Love him deeply. God bless you.